This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church here in London, Ontario.
And my name is Kevin George. I am Dean of Huron, Rector of St. Paul's Cathedral in beautiful downtown London. Enjoying a beautiful Sunday morning. You too, Rob?
Very much so. Up and at 'em this morning, real early.
Did your day start at 7?
I had to get up at 7. Yeah.
Oh, good for you.
It's okay.
Good for you. Me too.
But that's okay. And for those of you watching on YouTube right now, watching the podcast on YouTube, you'll notice a third party here, and our guest is Bishop Todd Townshend from the Diocese of Huron. So, Bishop, great to have you with us. We're going to take care of a little business beforehand, and then we're going to get into a wonderful conversation today. So, we're looking forward to that. And so this is our 11th season, Kevin.
Believe it or not.
Where has the time gone?
Well,
and our third episode this year. So we're back and glad to be with you. We are going to have Kevin do his land acknowledgement, and then we've got some wonderful sponsors to thank, and then we're going to get into some conversation.
Awesome. So we always like to begin by acknowledging that the lands upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, Métis, Inuit, First Nations, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we wish to work to walk together on a two-road path towards reconciliation. And as we always take time to think about ways in which we've participated in the brokenness and think about ways in which we might participate in healing. It's a difficult process, but there's our acknowledgement today.
We have some wonderful sponsors that help us keep things going here on the podcast. We want to recognize them today. So first to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And again, our thanks to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George today for their continued support.
Great people, deadly people over there. That's good people. And we don't often get to do this with the sponsor in-house,
Yes.
but we're very thankful for the sponsorship of the Diocese of Huron. And we know the Diocese of Huron is a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan, come together to worship and to serve. And every week we say we thank Bishop Todd Townshend for his support of the podcast and sponsorship. And now we can say it with him sitting right there. Thank you, Todd.
All right.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And-
this is a great thing.
And we want to give our thanks to Molly Maid once again here in London. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Thanks, Tricia, for being part of the podcast and for your continued support. And, you know, we always say, Kevin and I might look like we're well put together, but
no.
there's a team behind it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Molly Maid's a big part of that. Keeps
All
us
of this
nice and
beauty
tidy
doesn't
and
happen.
organized.
This
That's
takes
right.
a lot of work.
That's right. So thanks to all our sponsors today. And again, we're so happy that Bishop Todd can join us today. So lots to talk about. Kevin, why don't you kick things off?
Well, just first off, we often have these fancy introductions about these theologians we've had on and so on, but we have a theologian with us today who most of us in these parts know. But Todd has been bishop now for, I guess it's 4 years, or because I think Todd started just as the pandemic started. So he came to us in January of 2024, and then boom, he got to begin his episcopacy with all the nonsense that we had to deal with, and skillfully and faithfully and diligently has led us through a very difficult time. And we thought this would be a good opportunity to have you on, Todd, and welcome you, because you took a sabbatical recently, and through that time, part of what you did was help us get focused by working with others to create a document called Turning to Grace, a diocesan plan, which will soon be presented at our diocesan synod, which is coming up in about a month or so here. And we thought this would be a good opportunity to unpack that a bit and to thank you for all that you do here in the diocese and for us. So welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, Rob, everybody.
We thought before we get into the Turning to Grace, we have just a off the wall question. Like, we have this podcast, this little thing Rob and I are doing here, right? So and then the Diocese of Huron is kind enough to sponsor that. Like, why would you sponsor this nonsense? Like, I'm speaking in jest. I hope it's better than nonsense, but we're very thankful for what you do. I wonder if you have a word or two about the podcast and why the diocese would support this.
Oh, yeah, great. Well, I mean, even in the midst of nonsense, there's gems to be found.
Yes.
But it's not, like you said, not nonsense. There's one is the we use every means possible to talk about the gospel in the world and the ways in which we can respond. So finding ways, and of course, this expanded and accelerated for a lot of people through the pandemic, where they're a capacity to create a community or learn something or just access something valuable for their life came into their home. Lots of people, of course, before that could do that. So just the ways in which this is done. Podcasts are, portable and they're repeatable, and you can listen to them in the car, on a walk. You can sit down and do it. It's a real service, I think, to one another to find ways to stay in conversation. And it's on demand, all those kind of things that are convenient for people. But more importantly, the content. It's the content, the things you talk about. You can have the right people in the right moment talking about the right things, and it can transform lives either all at once or a bit at a time. So I just think the things you focus on, the kind of work you put into preparing to engage with people from all over the place, it's just a beautiful gathering spot for stuff. So yeah, we support this strongly and would love to see more.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm so glad of the support, and both Kevin and I are, because one of the things that we've realized over the years is the gift that we've had in being able to expand this with this Zoom format and such. Because when this all started, it was just Kevin and I in the upper room of a pub, getting local people to come by and chat about things. But the fact that we've been able to talk to folks in England, through the United States, across the globe, has really been an extra for us that we hadn't even imagined before. So
I do miss the pub.
I do too, but it's always there. It's always there, Kevin.
We're not as
We can always go.
It's not as though we haven't checked it out since, but
No, they haven't kicked us out of there specifically.
No,
It's
no,
just
no,
that we don't go.
Yeah, it's true. All right, let's talk about turning to grace. I just think that there's so much we've all been challenged with over the years in parish ministry. I know Rob probably feels the same way I do about this, Todd, that we're fortunate that we have a bishop who is looking at this in a broad sense and looking towards the future and not obsessed about, sort of turning the lights out in 2040 or whatever the heck it said on that front page thing in the journal years ago. And really sort of giving us an opportunity now as a diocese when we gather in October to focus our attention on a way forward, and to do so not just with strategic plans are strategic plans, but this is more than that, because it's really a plan rooted in faith and rooted in the practices of the church, which are so critical, I believe, to where we're going. In the preamble of the document, you talk about change being constant and how the world is in a constant state of flux. And we know that that's true in everything around us, but people in church land sometimes tend to find that more difficult when we're changing in church. I like what you say, and that you say when change is rooted in God's continuing creative and redemptive activity, it's always good. So I wonder if you can sort of lay out for us at the beginning of this, around that notion of why do this now, why change is so critical for us to embrace, and this attempt that we're making to embrace change together with a plan.
Well, change isn't always good because who wants the change is an important question. Who benefits from the change? There are all kinds of people around who would change things to suit them or to benefit them, and some people are very, very good at that. So it is important to me that this is, and I feel deeply that the Christian life through the centuries, but also the God who inspires it and keeps it alive, is a God of diversity and change and newness. So that things that are familiar and old and comfortable can bring a certain good, but with that, not in place of that, this newness. I mean, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead was a pretty big change, and it had a reason. It had an effect that was obviously humongous. So it really is rooted in a God, in believing in a God who would change, but also the whole Christian tradition is a matter of people going into new places or new periods of time in a same place, and enculturating, changing, adapting to that, so that the thing can come alive, whatever the thing is. So communities do evolve by body is changing. Everybody's changing. That's what life is like. So to assume that we could be not changing is to want to be inert or frozen in one place, and that we do want to cling to wonderful things.
Yeah.
But even those evolve, and that's where the good stuff is.
Yeah. You speak about it by way of sort of two objectives. One of them sort of being that to embrace the moment, and then the other one is for us to collectively get the will to do things that we know we have to do in terms of the stewardship, and not just the past but the future. I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit.
Well, yeah, once you sort of consent to or embrace the idea that things are going to look different and new and unknown, there isn't just a switch that gets flipped and it all happens. We're actually participants in it. We make the change with God's help and lead. So yeah, we have to do some things, and we have to think about not only how that affects current communities and people, but future ones. So I feel strongly that this hasn't always been an opportunity, but 5 years ago when I was invited to begin to think about these things as a candidate for ministry, Episcopal ministry, I started to pull things together from my whole life, but at the same time I think a little differently, and I do think it's we can recognize a time of opportunity here to not just get ahead of things like a business would in a competitive environment, but to recognize that the church is, in this point in time, in this part of the world, is currently doing something in society that most other organizations are not doing. We overlap with a lot of other good organizations who have similar goals in mind, but where do you find communities where you have the opportunity to learn what the mystery of God is really like? To where can you find a place where people can be who they are and find out who they are and what they're supposed to be in life, and find that kind of identity, a community that, where things like sin and wrongdoing and harm are confessed openly and met with unconditional love and forgiveness and healing, all kinds of things that aren't necessarily going to happen other places. We do, and that's why these practices are something I keep emphasizing, is because this is something that we need, but also there are lots of people in the world who would benefit greatly from it and find joy in it. So I think there's something really important in that. And then the other thing is, the churches are still, the people of goodwill and good faith are still a force in the world for making a material difference in the places they live for the people who are most harmed or marginalized by stuff. So I just believe in it, and I think there's a great opportunity to shift our energies and resources into all of these things more deeply.
Awesome.
Yeah. In the Turning to Grace document that we have a hold of and that will be available to those in the diocese, and I know in its full form and in a summary form as well shortly. There's a section in the principles section where we talk about being a new church, and we are a new church. And one of the images you paint for us and give us is the scriptural story of the first Easter morning, and how that understanding of what it looks like to be a new church can be formed out of that. So this is the student now going back to the church. As you years ago, Todd taught homiletics to me years ago. So I'm coming back. So how does that image of that first Easter morning present itself to us so that we can be informed on what it is to be a new church? How did you kind of parse that out?
Well, it's just it's the central. It's the thing that interprets everything else. So that it's a big. There's not an answer to it. There's a life to live.
That's right. Yeah.
Together. But yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first responses to the resurrection for those who were drawn into it were cries of surprise and wonder, and the people to whom it was proclaimed that it had happened, couldn't really believe it. It was a rejection of something that was so beyond normal or expected, or even perceived as good. That there's, that whole first part, everybody's running around in fear. So we don't imply that the kind of new creation that God provides is an easy shift or a smooth road. It requires upheaval at times, but at the same time, as people started to absorb the reality of this and the possibility of it, their lives just came alive and energized, and they saw pretty much everything differently. So we live, couple thousand years after that. So it's a bit hard sometimes to capture that sense of surprise or wonder. But it is, coming up on Sunday, we're going to hear about Jesus putting a child in the midst of people and say, there's a wonder of you can be childlike in all of this, even though it's a path to holiness. So I just think that the resurrection, of course, of Jesus is central to Christianity.
Right.
Not so much as a doctrine as an expectation.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's who we are and whose we are, and we're an Easter people, but not one day a year. Right. And
Right. Yeah.
we carry that throughout the course of the year. You're right too, in that section, that in most respects, the church of the 20th century is gone. Ways of thinking and acting, along with the culture and infrastructure that supported ministry in that century, are often barriers to imaginatively and faithfully meeting the challenges and opportunities of this century. So that's a tough one, isn't it, for folks? Because we don't want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater and say everything before doesn't count anymore. But at the same time, it can also, as you say, be a bit of a roadblock for us when we try to stay back here and not think imaginatively and faithfully, but what's next. So how do we kind of sit in that central time and that middle time, and how does this turning to grace kind of help us in that space?
I obviously was centrally involved in piecing this together and providing some of the language for it over several years. And others like Archdeacon Stephen McClatchy really helped piece it together. But then when we brought it around the diocese for people to improve or challenge, or because I really want this to be something that we say amen to together. It's our own voice, all of us. Yeah. But that was one of the lines that was tough. You're right, Rob, because it's a bit of an overstatement or not clear statement to say that the Church of the 20th century is gone. I mean, the 20th century is gone in one sense, in an obvious way. You can't relive it.
We can try,
but we can't. We're not going to succeed.
If we're not going to succeed.
But on the other hand, I do have empathy with this resistance, and there should be some, because it isn't that everything about that is not baby out with the bathwater. It's actually keeping the baby.
Yes.
Right? It's the bathwater's going. The bathwater's stale. It was great one time. It did what it was supposed to do, and we put fresh water in the font. So it's more like it really is keeping the baby. So there's some of the things that were cherished through those decades, especially for people who lived through them. aren't gone. They've just got new, there's all kinds of images for this in the scripture, especially from Jesus. New wineskins for new wine. I mean, that all that stuff about newness doesn't imply replacement. It isn't an obliteration of one thing for the sake of a whole new other thing. It's what's happened all along. The thing grows, it evolves. It's more like a biological, the way trees and plants grow. They grow out of itself in a new way.
I just wonder actually if we could take it's not really a detour, but a sidestep here, Rob, just in terms of some of what both of us are dealing with in our own communities right now with respect to what Todd just said, because I think that like we've got a vestry coming up here on Sunday. This is recorded on a Thursday, released on a Monday. So by now, when this is will be released, we'll know if I've left town or if I'm still here. I think I'll still be here.
You will be leaving town.
I am leaving town on Monday. That's a whole different story. But like here at St. Paul's, we've been engaged with conversations with Relevin, formerly Trinity Centers Foundation, as has Rob with Holy Trinity St. Stephen's. How it's manifesting itself here is we're engaged right now in some deep conversation about a reordering of our worship space, which would include a removal of pews, putting in accessibility, making the space more comfortable, perhaps air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. And this actually speaks to this particular thing. When I was reading this in its final form, and I read that line again, and it was like, the 20th century, right? It's like everything we want to hold most dear to is still here. But there are things about being church today that we need to make change to make happen. And Rob's got some interesting stuff going on at Holy Trinity. I always say a word about that, Rob, but then perhaps the bishop's reaction about why these things are reflective of that. Rob, do you want to say a word about Holy Trinity?
Yeah, well, we're in a opportunity now, and the work that's been done over the last few years to look at a complete reorganization of the property that we're on the corner of Southdale and Wellington in London, and we're going down a path that will, when finished, and we hope to get to that point, of course, but when finished, it's not just going to be a church on a corner, but a new building with housing and opportunities for community engagement and such. And so this is a whole redoing of what it is to be church, a different way of functioning as a community, a new organizational structure around our buildings. So it is a brand new thing that's happening. But it is coming out of is what we've been talking about, is kind of the ability to be able to say, the things that we love so much, like the buildings, they're not serving us anymore. We're serving them. And so we need to be able to move into a new direction. And, we want the building to be serving us and our community, as opposed to all our resources going into just maintaining something that just, quite frankly, isn't happening anymore. We need to, it's our way, I guess, of putting new water in the font, right? So these are some of the things that we're working on right now in partnership with the diocese. And, we're looking forward to that newness in our little corner of the city and see what happens with that. But it's a great opportunity, and it's a way to move out of something into something new. And, like that Easter morning, there's a lot of fear around it and things that are not recognizable in any way, shape, or form. But the promise that something will be revealed to us and more will be revealed as we move forward through it in faith.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you both for the leadership in those places. I thought of saying that earlier, but didn't want to detour the conversation. But it really is taking some imaginative and courageous leadership by clergy people and lay people, key lay people, who are seeing this. I think that the thing about being part of a Christian community in this part of the world is that most of what we have was given as a gift. And it was given as a gift for certain purposes, but gifts then belong to the people in whose hands it is. So there's a responsibility of receiving this gift. It's not an obligation to the giver if it's a true gift. So it is about what you do with it right now. But then these actions are to serve us and the people around us as a way of saying, we think this is a good thing, and we need to know what is a good thing for those people and all of us at the same time. So it's usually you can't predict the future, but you can begin to imagine it. And it is remarkable to me in all parts of our diocese where while this is a fraught conversation potentially, and there are some who can't engage in it in a healthy or good way for them, there are lots of others where it just brings energy. You see this sort of return in the eyes in a way. So it's a widening of the eyes, both in terms of, oh boy, are we really doing this? But also, I can see that. I can see the possibilities here, and that usually ignites human beings and brings them together. Really, crisis times can bring people together for a whole bunch of good and bad reasons. It is a crisis/opportunity to go into these times. So it takes some serious leadership, and I'm grateful to you and the folks you work with.
Well, so go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to say, speaking of crises, this whole redevelopment that we're doing and visioning we're doing came out of the crisis of the pandemic.
Yeah.
If the pandemic had not happened, and there were some, there was a building we were using, an old rectory that was bringing in income, and we were living off that, and everything was fine and dandy, and we could do the things we normally do and weren't thinking much about it. But when that ended, it was a now what, right? And this is what was revealed to us through that crisis. So that's definitely one way that we look and say, where is God faithful? You see it there coming out of that ultimate, what could have been easily a death, but something new came out of that, and we're thankful for that.
And I think, Rob, I mean, you're probably seeing this as well, but what I'm seeing here is we talk about redeveloping the worship space and trying to engage as a creative sector hub and bringing people in and all of what that entails. What we're seeing is exactly what the bishop just described, which is, we've got some people who are frightened to death and are just focused on the stench of the tomb, right? Like that is a piece of it. But mostly what I'm seeing is that wide-eyedness, that sort of, wait a minute,
Really?
Like there's, there is new life, resurrection. There is a possibility here because people, I mean, look, we just have to face the stark reality for a lot of our people and a lot of our congregations that have dwindled and gotten to a place where the buildings, as you put it, Rob, we're serving the buildings because they're like a millstone around our neck. For a lot of people, they don't see a way out. And when you begin to vision faithfully and prayerfully and think about ways in which you can steward what we have in different ways, which is what the bishop is encouraging us to do in this document, we do see a wide-eyed splendor from most of our people, actually, which is really exciting.
Well, we begin to have to trust God.
Imagine.
Because we step into these things, and if it was just our own capacities to do any of it, it wouldn't happen. But people start to catch a feeling that, wow, God's involved in this somehow. And we don't try to nail that down or capture it in a bottle and sell it. We follow it.
That's
we
right.
Enjoy it. We participate in it. It's a wonderful life.
Yeah, it is wonderful. And it's generous. And it's on that sense that I guess the next thing I wanted to ask you is in the principles, you talk right about a generous orthodoxy, recognizably Anglican, but generously Orthodox, which I really love that expression, of course, thinking back to years ago and Brian McLaren and the generous orthodoxy and the way he wrote about that. Friend of the podcast. We say friend of the podcast. And sometimes that word gets used in as a bit of a cudgel in the church. It can be used in certain circles to say, well, that's not Orthodox, or or to describe oneself as, well, I'm Orthodox. But what you're writing about and what's being put together and proposed in here is a generous orthodoxy. I wonder if you can say some more about that. Yeah.
Well, certainly Brian's writing about it and talking about it was in there. There's also some other people, Graham Tomlin in England and others who have put those words together in a way that I found helpful. And so it's a whole bunch of angles on this, and it's one of the reasons why I did kind of debate with folks a bit whether we should use these phrases or not, because they are ambiguous to a certain extent, but they do. One thing about the diocesan plan that it leaves some things out. Right? Whenever there's anything like this, you gotta say, well, this is intentional and this is careful.
Yeah,
there's some things that are not in here. So how do we find the limits of who we are and what our mission is, while also being as expansive as the Anglican communion is worldwide, right? Mm-hmm. There's massive diversity. Of course, that's one of the pillars. But to say generous and orthodox, there are those who would say those words just do not belong together. You can be one but not the other. Now, those are people who I don't think understand either one of the words fully. Mm-hmm. they've narrowed it down too much. But orthodoxy is, in its simplest form, the right praise of God. It's meet and right so to do is an old English phrase from it's fitting.
Yeah.
It's not correct. It's not right and wrong. But boy, that fits. Boy, that resonates. Here's some of the language we'd use now. Boy, that, it's just something about that seems right. It's not a matter of, yes, that's exactly it and nothing else shall be. But there's a real fittingness to it. And it's orthodoxy also in the sense that it connects to other parts, very different parts of the world, across time or across geography, that others in a totally different environment would say, yes, that's right. That's fitting for us too, right? So it holds a lot of things together. And the generosity part of it is, a lot of human conversation and political discourse is the opposite of generous. Like it is, it's like I don't even have a word for it. Maybe it's obscenely something. We have adjectives. I don't know what the word is. But
it's very toxic. It's very toxic. Let's put it that way.
That's the result. Yeah. So and that can leak into our lives. I have my moments where
me too.
I feel I probably create a little toxic drop or two here or there. But honestly, everything good in my life has come from this generous, gracious. Grace is a less understood word, but generosity. People know what generosity is. They've experienced it, and they have experienced the absence of it. So I think that if we can be that way with one another, with limits, that's why we're defining some things in the plan as well.
Right.
And recognizably, Anglican is also important to me, but the key there is recognizable to whom. So there's Anglicans. I've had a couple of opportunities to be at international gatherings of Anglicans, and if it's recognizable to all of them, that's Anglican to me in some way. Every single one of them will say, maybe not for me, but that's us.
Yeah. Turning to grace is held up by three important pillars that we want to talk about. And, much like the chairs we're sitting on, we need something to kind of prop it all up and keep us steady. So that's what
very, very important in my case, Rob, because if if the legs of the chair are weak, then that's not going to end well.
The pillars are being a learning church, a just church, and a diverse church. So we want to just kind of take a look at each of those in our conversation today. So a learning church. Jesus says in Matthew, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." And as followers in the way of Jesus, we are disciples, and turning to grace points that out. We're pupils, always learning Jesus' ways, living in him. And learning in faith is about formation, more than just sticking information into our heads. We can do that all the time with a lot of words and fancy theology and things like that. All good and important, but if we're not being formed by that somehow and making meaning from it, then we're just leaving it sitting there. So can you talk a little bit why what's that so important for you and for turning to grace, that we embrace this idea of learning, and what does that look like for us in our parishes?
Well, one of the ways that these three things evolved as sort of key elements, pillars, as we said, that structurally hold us up and we can cling to in a way. In a way, it's a more learning church, more just, more diverse. We already are these things. So these are us anyway. Anglicans in past times have always valued education. That's one part of learning, but the discovery, the sense of Christianity is a faith of revelation. So there's going to be discovery, and there's going to be a need to absorb that and live it to understand it. So this whole process of coming to be a Christian is a form of learning and being a pupil, being a follower, a disciple of Jesus. So, disciples of Jesus, lots of people can't learn in certain ways. They weren't given those gifts. They have other gifts. It's not, like you said, about that just one kind of learning, but everybody grows and learns in certain ways, and often that's one of the joys of life. So to really create more space for that and to see it as a central activity, that's part of what is hoped here, is that sometimes we get distracted and we make our central activity, which takes most of our time and energy, something that isn't central. It can be forced on us too. I'm not blaming people for that, but there's an opportunity to make this central. Spend a big chunk of your time doing this. That's being church. And I think that for me, in particular with learning, I grew up in the church and with a Christian family, but it was the appropriation and the reception of all this stuff into my life personally through learning and living out what I'm learning that just works for me. So I think it's not, it's personal for me, but I think for each of us, it is in our own way as we start to imagine that. So, these aren't all just studies. This is a learning church right here, what we're doing. We're engaging with one another. It opens up my eyes to new things. I hear things in a new way. It's a process of discovery in the learning part.
Yeah, there's many opportunities in the ways that we gather that we're not sometimes recognizing that we could be learning. I know people have parish council meetings every night and we take care of business. But what if we were to spend 15, 20 minutes of that time together having these kind of conversations and learning from each other and expanding those times we're together where we're doing the work of the church, which is important, but we want to also do the work of discipleship and balance those two. So
one of my, anybody who's a parent or has people around with whom you engage in a sense you want to help them grow will understand this. I have asked our kids from time to time, what did you learn from that? Usually after something that maybe wasn't as pleasant or self-inflicted. Yeah. And the response came back one time, you really have to learn something from everything.
Yeah.
And it's a good question, but you can, you can.
Well, I was just thinking as you said that, Rob, about a former colleague who was excoriated by a parish council member when he spoke to me. He said, "This guy showed up at our parish council meeting and gave us this book, and it was the Once and Future Church by Lawrence Mead, Lorne Mead, pardon me, the small book, right?" And he says, "This guy wants us reading a book at parish council. We're there to do business." Yeah. And it broke open this conversation. And in our argument, we were learning. I was learning from him about his fixation on his worry about the church survival, which is so much of what eats up our time. Going to what the bishop just said about what do we direct our time at? That's often what much of our time is directed at. And this man cared passionately about his church for that. And then me trying to at least hopefully impart something that he might learn from me, that perhaps we can do that and we can still take our time together as opportunities for learning. Right, that we need to be reminded that it's not just about the upkeep of the church. In fact, it's primarily not about that. It's about this discipleship piece, right? And living out our baptism. That's where rubber hits the road.
Well, and it's an understandable thing. We do need to balance those things. Obviously, it's creating more space for some of the central business that we put aside. There's all kinds of. The obsession. It is an obsession. It's a blinding obsession that we have with productivity.
Yes.
In an economy kind of language, that's a good thing, and it ought to be valued, but to the exclusion of different kinds of economy that are about life and creation that are also valid and important.
Yeah. So moving into Pillar 2, it's about being a more just church. And this section really is critically important in our day and age. We began this podcast with a land acknowledgement, which we run the danger of nowadays. We had a great conversation at our Reason Clericus about land acknowledgements and making sure that we're not just sort of doing something by rote, and being reminded by the Reverend Hannah Scorer, who's at Oneida, about the importance of doing them, but also putting more meat behind that as well. And the business of reconciliation is so high on I know your agenda, Bishop, as it is on so many. And I just quoting from your charge to Synod in 2020, which each of those, that's the other I have to say to you, refreshing thing. Every one of your charges has been something I've quoted. I don't ever remember quoting Bishop's charges before, I have to admit, but I have quoted yours repeatedly. So well done. But you write, pray, then by emptying ourselves of the desire to be right and renouncing our desire to turn everything into our own advantage. Pardon me, I'm going to say that again. Pray, then by emptying of ourselves of the desire to be right and renouncing our desire to turn everything to our own advantage. Then by turning to God to see what kind of justice God desires and acting on it. And I think that this is an important piece for us as a church right now. And as you say, St. Paul describes reconciliation as, and perhaps the key Christian activity. So I wonder if you can say more about this particular pillar and why it's so critical for us right now as a church.
Yeah, the sense of justice being putting things right is deep. It's goes way back into the Jewish people of God understanding of justice, and the major religions all have this as a central thing that we can't invent a justice of our own. It is through a divine source that justice comes. So it's a complicated thing to understand, and we're caught up in all the injustices. Mm-hmm. Some much more than others, and people are in privileged places, but we're all sort of in it together. So it's hard to see something that is just sometimes, but other times it's totally obvious. And those at least are the places to work hard when it becomes totally obvious. You also have to be looking at the things that we haven't noticed as unjust. I mean, there's a whole, that's the advantage of looking back in time. Mm-hmm. It looks really obvious from here. So how we do those things, starting with the really clear, obvious ones that are directly commanded of us because they're simple. There's a whole tradition of prophets who are about this, mm-hmm. and it isn't always just castigating people for doing wrong. It is this God's justice is such a good thing for everybody. Like this is really good for everybody. So that's part of it. I do think that there are those in the church who this is not new to them. That this is in some ways this is their thing, and that's what they do. Maybe to the exclusion of all other things. So they might want to find some balance with other parts of this as well. But following their lead, we know most of the things we should be doing. It's a matter of doing them. But on the other hand, you have to really resource yourself to understand that you're not imposing some other injustice in the meantime as you do it. It's a wonderful challenge. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. It all comes down to God's mercy for all, and really trusting that justice is a benefit to everybody.
Yeah, and back in April, we received the Cross and Nails here from the community of the Cross and Nails from Coventry, England. Dean John Whitcomb was here, and we're in the process here at St. Paul's of having some conversations now about what that means for us. But we received that here at St. Paul's on behalf of the diocese, as it's a diocesan commitment. And so I don't know if you want to say a word about that as well, Bishop.
Well, and to, that symbol for reconciliation is a major opportunity for us. So I really love the fact that it's here, and the fact that the Coventry, it comes out of European war and a kind of reconciliation that fits for many of the people in southwestern Ontario. But it also sheds light on other kinds of reconciliation in a really helpful way. So it's kind of a combination of two continents' histories in one symbol. But coming back to the letter of Paul speaking about God was in Christ reconciling all things to God's self. This is something we reclaim from time to time as a central activity, usually after catastrophe. At a micro level within relationships, catastrophe, or a macro level in terms of war or what happened to Indigenous people, those kind of things. So, but it is just sort of, and I know. I've said it before, Richard Lisher, I first heard it from, that this is the thesis statement of the New Testament. If you want one sentence, God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. Yeah. And we have been made ambassadors of that reconciliation. So if you want a mission,
there it is.
Go around work everywhere you go. There's reconciliation and healing necessary. Yeah. And we get to practice it in real ways in Canada because of our own history and future. So it's just a beautiful thing, reconciliation. But there are some, Desmond Tutu in South Africa and all kinds of people who have helped folks learn how to do it. We've unlearned how to do it in so many ways. So it's just, it's a practice that's super central because it allows human flourishing.
Right. Learning church, just church, diverse church is the third pillar. One of the great gifts of the church is that we've inherited different streams of tradition, and they've come together and have in many wonderfully diverse ways. And so, we were talking about this the other night, I think at Deanery Council, about seeing the diversity that's showing up in our parishes here in London, Ontario, with many different people that, quite frankly, don't look like the three in this Zoom call, that are entering into our spaces and from Anglican traditions, and things to them may look different, from their vantage point. But there's also wonderful gifts that they bring into that as well. And so we're actually seeing that diversity start to take place in and around our context right here. But you talk about diversity in the idea of the common goal of that is unity, right? Unity in Christ. Can you say more about the importance of diversity and how we can focus on moving into those spaces faithfully and openly, because it's going to be a big part, I think, of the next decades ahead of us as the Anglican Church, for sure.
Yeah. Well, one of the starting points for me was just the diversity of Anglicans across the globe. So, the Anglican Communion has churches in 165 countries or something like that, and millions of people. But the differences are what people would notice first. How can people be so different from one another and be part of the same body or the same group? And that has all kinds of folks who would want to emphasize difference. Diversity also, in my weeks out beginning of the year in Sabbath, I was reading indiscriminately in a way, but I came back to some stuff around having studied science and have an interest in biological things. I was reading about biodiversity, both from indigenous and scientific perspectives and from a theological perspective, just happened to be doing it. And that sense of biodiversity, the diversity of creation itself, the more you get into it, even in soil, it isn't just creatures. It's just everything about creation has this diversity in it, and yet it comes together in one functioning organism in a sense, or set of organisms. So that was beautiful to me. So I find that a very appealing thing. So I want to. I don't really know how I became like this as a person, but I see it in church life that the same kind of difference is part of the created order on purpose. So why would I see that as a bad thing? The challenge is that difference is difficult to negotiate because of our own cultural expectations. What is norm? What is normal? Because it's whatever's normal is almost certainly.
Hey, someone's having a birthday over there. Wait.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Bishop. I don't know if it's your birthday, but there's some balloons here. For those
There's
of you
a lot of hot air sending those balloons.
For those of you listening, on the Zoom call, balloons just appeared out of nowhere. It was absolutely magnificent. The Holy Spirit is rising.
I will admit that I don't know how that happened.
That's great.
Which I often say.
Yeah.
So, but a little distracted by that. What did I say? And who knows what I was saying? About diversity.
Yes.
So this idea of, and it's not really, equity, diversity, inclusion. That's a small piece of a bigger thing that we're talking about. Right. This is sort of to say, no, this is a good and beautiful thing. Now, how do we become interculturally competent people?
Yeah,
and that's a major learning task, because all this difference it's difficult enough to get along when we all share a very similar culture. But so language, differences across language, that's the most obvious one for people. Our companion diocese is in Brazil, and the English speakers and the Portuguese speakers find a common ground with a few words and a few people who can help us do that. And yet all this stuff can happen. So across languages is scary to some people who don't speak many languages. But it is a whole new way. So it's a diversity of language and culture coming together into one place in a Pentecost kind of way, where everyone recognizes the language of themselves as place for home. So there's all kinds of skills involved in that. Little things like, we're hospitable people. We have radical hospitality. We're going to host these people in our house, our ways. those kind of things those things have to come down to the point where we share this place. There are people from across the Anglican communion and others who show up at the church door to their church.
Yes.
Right.
They walk up to that church, and go through the door, and to them, it's their church. This is it's Anglican there.
Yeah.
I'm Anglican. Yeah. And they're not a guest. They're part of the body already. So these kind of shifts, plus many others, are part of the work there. And again, the upside is massive.
I think
the witness, we have the chance to witness to the whole world that this is something that's good.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just find embracing the diversity, if you're willing to step into that, it makes you curious, right?
Yeah.
It makes you go, the diversity isn't the thing that stops you. It's not a wall. There's a curiousness that can come out of it. Say, what's that all about? And that actually then goes right back to pillar one. So we can do a whole circle. That informs my interest in learning, and then my interest in perhaps justice, and then entering into diversity again to be more curious. And it's a wonderful circle. And
also,
I think that Turning to Grace really captures that.
Also eye-opening, right? Like you see, you go back to that. But I was just thinking about this as you were saying it, because here at the Cathedral, because we're downtown, right, and so many of these folks come from Anglican traditions, particularly on the African continent, and they come here, and the first thing they do is they go to their cathedral, right? It's their church, and the actual language is exactly as the bishop is saying it. When people approach someone from Nigeria, say, or Uganda or Congo, and they say, "Oh, well, welcome," as if they're coming from something different, they immediately respond with, "I'm an Anglican." And we had a situation here early on in my arrival where there was an evangelical African church gathering in the afternoons in our hall, and one of our folks said, "Oh, you might want to join the afternoon community," right? And the immediate response was, "My father is a bishop." I may not look like you, but man, Anglicans don't look like you. So a part of that here has been about sort of having to acknowledge our own participation systemically in this stuff, and understanding that Anglican tradition is broader than 17th century England, say, in the ways we express ourselves all the time. And I'm, being facetious, but not. But it's like, how do we begin to encompass all of Anglican tradition, at least bits of it, in ways that people can recognize their church when they show up at their church? It goes back to what Todd was saying earlier about that generous orthodoxy. It's like, what is it that we do that would, because what I see is people who come, met a family here not very long ago, very excited when they met us. "Oh, this is going to be my church." And then the guy shows up on Sunday morning, he had told me about how he was in his choir back home. And I saw him slowly shrivel up in the front pew as he got through church because of the music and the whole thing. And I just saw the look on his face. And afterwards, I had a chance to talk to him and say, we're working on this. Because and so what we see is people who are coming, and then they're finding other expressions of church that are not Anglican to try and hold them together until they find something that is. And that's, I think, the challenge that we have.
Well, and understanding why you love something from your own cultural world is important, because you don't have to lose that. Saying to somebody whose music is different for worship, "I love this, and you love that," and there's a way to have both of this here. Like this this is one of the genius of the Anglican world developed, is that yes, that's all us. So, but it doesn't mean you have to delete the things you love the most.
No,
it's like the baby in the bathwater. You keep the baby. Know the baby.
But you add some. But you add some new water. Then
you bring in. You see other people have babies too.
Yes. Right.
So it really is, in a way, I guess, that to take the metaphor to its end, it's loving our and everybody else's baby.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
well, and I mean, it really is, to go to discipleship, it really is our baptism, right? We say we're going to respect the dignity of every human being, right? If we approach the other with the sense of, you've got to be like me, we're not respecting the dignity of the other. And Ted Hebert at McCormick Theological Seminary writes about this in writing about Pentecost and the story of the Tower of Babel. And he says that story really is about diversity, that what God is is perplexed or upset about or wants to react to, is perhaps a better way to put it, is, and it says it 3 times in the text, that which is an indicator that what's being called out is they spoke one way and behaved in one way. And so the God needs things up so that something different rises up. And that diversity is a gift. It's not a punishment. It's not sending people away in a sense they can't understand, but it's about bringing a diversity of creation to light so that we can see different expressions and different ways of loving.
Yeah. And the many streams of tradition that are all valid, that flow together. It's our opportunity in this time for sure. Yeah. And I'm so glad this is happening in our neighborhoods, it's creating opportunity for all of us.
Yeah.
So to maybe put a bow on this today, there's a lot more in there, and parishes in the diocese and those of us that are leading them and participating in them are going to see more of this rolling out over the next little while. Bishop Todd, just maybe what's your hope for the next 6 months to a year as we prepare to really dive deep into this and start working on it with each other and throughout our diocese?
Well, my hope, a bunch of them, but one of them is really focused one, is that the congregations, the communities of people across the Diocese of Huron would see this and see themselves in it, to be provided with some common language to use with one another so that we know what we mean when we say things to one another, don't misunderstand each other, but also primarily that something in it would say, that is something we could do. That is something we want to do. That may be a challenge for us, but we're missing that piece. And maybe we're going to stop that, but we are going to embrace this. So I just think creating pathways and opportunities, partnerships with other people are a really important part of this. That folks in these congregations will say, I don't necessarily absorb all of this or want all of this, but here's something I think is really good for us, and we're going to give that a whirl.
Perfect.
And I think that I think I'm understanding that it'll be on the diocesan website. You'll see it before synod. Folks are willing to engage in it in whatever way possible. And I also know that
there'll be a section that has, it'd be broken into pieces so you can find parts of it, and there'll be studies, there'll be things that'll keep evolving with it. So it'll be look on the website mainly. I mean, it's a long document if you want to read it, but it's designed to be digital.
That's right. And the summary is very good too. And I would also say to listeners who are in our diocese, but certainly those beyond, but for those in the diocese, I have to say that we have a bishop who is completely engaged. So between the bishop, Stephen McClatchy, Archdeacon, who's assisted with this as well, your regional deans, your archdeacons, talk to them. Like bring your own feelings and thoughts and expressions of this. And, for us here on the podcast, we'd love to hear about this stuff too. If you're engaging these pillars in certain ways, we'd love to tell these stories because I think there are creative ways that things are being kneaded up, so to speak. The yeast is rising new things in the church. And we want, at least from a collegial perspective for Rob and I, it's, if you're a priest out there and you're involved in this, be in touch because this work brings its own level of weightiness. And I think being able to share that together is also quite important.
Yeah. Right. Oh, I can't wait to hear those stories. Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. Well, our guest today, Bishop Todd Townshend of the Diocese of Huron. Bishop Todd, thank you so much for your time today, but also, of course, your ministry, your engagement, and your support of us and everything we do, and for all the work that you put into this. I know it's going to be transformational in our diocese, and looking forward to doing more together with it.
Yes, thank you, Bishop.
Thank you, Rob and Kevin. Thank you both.
Thank you. Great. Good to have that conversation. And lots of great work coming up in the
Love
diocese.
Our Bishop. So love our Bishop, buddy.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Bishop Todd. We are going to be taking a couple of weeks off, folks, from the podcast, but we'll be returning in October. So we got some great guests coming up, Kevin, over the course of the month of October.
Well, let me tell you, here's who you need to look for. Okay. Well, first of all, let me say we're like Colbert, right? We take a hiatus every now and then so we can go to our cottages and take a ride in our fancy boat and do some fishing, play with the dog that I don't own and, all that stuff. So nobody's eating my dog. But anyway, here's who's coming up in October. Well, first of all, a reminder, 2 great events coming up early in October, right? So October the 2nd, a Wednesday evening, At Holy Trinity St. Stephen's, we're hosting Dr. Grace Ji-sun Kim for a public discussion of her book, When God Became White. So plan to join us for that. On the Saturday, October 5th, we are welcoming Dr. Danielle Tuminio Hansen, both of whom have been recent guests on the podcast. Danielle will be with us to talk about her book, Speaking of Rape, in an event which is co-sponsored by a whole host of people, including Inova and the London Abused Women's Center, to talk about intimate partner violence. Then in October, you'll have podcasts from Dr. Hamed Anker, who is an incredible psychologist who's immigrated here to London area in recent years and has overcome his own struggles with mental illness to have his practice. And a lot of that is rooted in his Muslim faith. And so you'll hear more from him. Our friend of the podcast, the Reverend Michael Corin, is releasing his memoir coming up very soon now in early October. It is called Heaping Coals, which is his journey from media firebrand to Anglican priest. So we're looking forward to hosting him. And then we'll have a discussion near the end of the month with Douglas Sanderson and Andrew Stobo Snyderman, who have an incredible book called Valley of the Bird Tale, which is an incredible story of the pain that comes from racism about white communities living with Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan. It's a great book, and you'll want to hear from these folks. So look for those guests coming up. Sorry for rambling on, Rob.
No worries. No worries. I just got to get to my cottage in time.
Yes, we got to get off the boat. The motor is running and gas is not cheap anymore.
Thanks to our sponsors again, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. To the Diocese of Huron and our Bishop, Todd Townshend. The Diocese of Huron is a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And, of course, to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. See you in a couple of weeks, my friends. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!